Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have everything money could buy, yet feel like you owned nothing at all? To be surrounded by unimaginable luxury while being trapped in a gilded cage of your own family's making? Well, tonight we're going to explore the extraordinary yet heartbreaking story of one of America's most fascinating heiresses. A woman whose life perfectly captures the contradictions and complexities of an entire era. Picture this. It's 1895, and the most lavish wedding ceremony America has ever witnessed is about to take place. The bride is just 18 years old, draped in satin and pearls worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But as she walks down that aisle, she's not walking toward love or happiness. She's walking toward a carefully orchestrated business transaction that will make her one of the most powerful duchesses in England, while simultaneously destroying any chance she might have had at genuine contentment. This is the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, and by the end of tonight's journey together, you'll understand not just her incredible rise to power and her devastating fall from grace, but also the hidden world of Gilded Age women who live behind marble facades and velvet curtains. You'll discover the secrets that these wealthy families desperately tried to hide, the betrayals that tore apart even the most prominent dynasties, and the shocking truth about what life was really like for the women who seemed to have everything. But before we dive into Consuelo's world, let me give you a glimpse of just how extraordinary her story truly is. This isn't just about one woman's struggle against the constraints of her time. This is about an entire generation of American heiresses who were essentially sold off to European nobility like precious commodities. It's about mothers who sacrificed their daughters' happiness for social status, about young women who rebelled against impossible expectations, and about a society that glittered on the surface while rotting from within. What makes Consuelo's story particularly compelling is that she left behind detailed memoirs and personal correspondence that reveal the stark contrast between her public image and her private torment. While newspapers portrayed her as living a fairy tale existence, her own words paint a picture of loneliness, manipulation, and quiet desperation that will both fascinate and disturb you. But Consuelo's story doesn't exist in isolation. It's woven into the larger tapestry of the Gilded Age, that extraordinary period in American history when vast fortunes were made and lost, when European aristocrats came hunting for American dollars, and when the line between business and personal relationships became increasingly blurred. Through her experiences, we'll uncover the hidden realities of what it meant to be a wealthy woman in an era that worshipped money, but offered little freedom to those who possessed it. The world that shaped Consuelo Vanderbilt was one of incredible contradictions. On one hand, these were women who lived in palatial mansions, wore jewels worth millions, and commanded armies of servants. They traveled in private railroad cars, hosted elaborate parties that lasted for days, and moved in circles where European royalty was considered ordinary company. Yet beneath all this splendor lay a system of control and manipulation that would shock modern audiences with its calculated cruelty. Consuelo's life began in 1877, at the height of America's Gilded Age, when her grandfather Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt's railroad and shipping empire had made the family one of the wealthiest in the world. But wealth, as Consuelo would learn from her earliest days, came with its own set of burdens and expectations that would shape every aspect of her existence. Her mother, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, was a force of nature who had fought her way into New York's most exclusive social circles through a combination of strategic marriages, architectural ambition, and sheer determination. Alva wasn't content to simply be wealthy. She wanted to be socially powerful, and she viewed her daughter as the ultimate tool for achieving that goal. From the moment Consuelo could walk and talk, her life was carefully orchestrated around preparing her for the marriage market. She was tutored by the finest teachers money could hire, not because her parents valued education for its own sake, but because accomplishment in languages, music, and art would make her a more attractive prospect to European nobility. She was dressed in the most fashionable clothes, not because she enjoyed them, but because appearance was everything in the world she was destined to inhabit. But perhaps most importantly, she was taught from an early age that her own desires and preferences were secondary to her family's ambitions. When she expressed interest in something that didn't align with her mother's plans, she was quickly redirected. When she showed signs of developing her own opinions or preferences, she was reminded of her duty to the family name. This wasn't unusual for wealthy families of the era, but in Alva's hands, it became a form of psychological warfare that would leave lasting scars on her daughter's psyche. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, where Consuelo spent her childhood, was itself a testament to the family's ambitions and contradictions. Designed to rival the greatest palaces of Europe, it was a showcase of wealth and taste that drew visitors from around the world. Yet for Consuelo, it often felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. Every room was designed for public display rather than private comfort. Every gathering was an opportunity for her mother to advance the family's social position, and every interaction was carefully monitored and controlled. As Consuelo grew into adolescence, the pressure to fulfill her mother's ambitions intensified dramatically. Alva had set her sights on European nobility, specifically British dukes, as the ultimate prize for her daughter. This wasn't an unusual goal among American heiresses of the time, but Alva pursued it with a single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. The strategy was both simple and ruthlessly effective. American industrialists had built enormous fortunes, but lacked the social prestige that came with centuries-old titles. Meanwhile, European aristocrats possessed ancient names and vast estates, but often lacked the liquid capital needed to maintain their lifestyle and properties. It was a perfect match from a business perspective, with American daughters serving as the valuable currency in these international transactions. But for the young women involved, these arrangements often meant leaving behind everything familiar and comfortable to live in foreign countries with men they barely knew, bound by social conventions that were even more restrictive than those they'd known in America. The fact that many of these marriages proved successful over time doesn't diminish the courage and adaptability required of the women who entered into them, often with little choice in the matter. Consuelo's story is particularly poignant because she had already found love with someone her mother considered completely unsuitable. Winthrop Rutherford was an American from a good family, but he lacked both the title and the vast wealth that Alva demanded for her daughter. The romance between Consuelo and Winthrop represented everything that Alva had worked to avoid. A match based on genuine affection rather than strategic advantage. The battle of wills between mother and daughter that followed would determine not just Consuelo's immediate future, but the trajectory of her entire life. It was a conflict that played out behind closed doors, but had implications that reached far beyond their family, touching on fundamental questions about women's autonomy, parental authority, and the price of social ambition that continue to resonate today. The confrontation between Consuelo and her mother over Winthrop Rutherford was nothing short of a psychological siege. Alva employed every weapon in her considerable arsenal: emotional manipulation, threats of disinheritance, appeals to family duty, and even claims about her own fragile health that would supposedly be destroyed by her daughter's disobedience. She enlisted allies among their social circle, ensuring that Consuelo was constantly reminded of the expectations placed upon her and the consequences of defying them. What made this battle particularly cruel was that Alva understood exactly how to exploit her daughter's deepest vulnerabilities. Consuelo had been raised to be dutiful and obedient, to place family honor above personal desire. She genuinely loved her mother despite everything, and the thought of causing her pain was almost unbearable. Alva weaponized this love, turning it into a tool of control that proved more effective than any lock or chain could have been. The pressure became so intense that Consuelo's health began to suffer. She lost weight, developed nervous symptoms, and found herself caught between the impossible choice of betraying her own heart or destroying her family relationships. Friends and relatives who might have offered support were either unaware of the full extent of the situation or were themselves invested in seeing the Vanderbilt family's social ambitions fulfilled. Meanwhile, Alva was actively pursuing her preferred candidate for her daughter's hand, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke possessed everything that Alva valued most: an ancient and prestigious title, vast estates in England, and desperate need for the kind of fortune that only an American heiress could provide. His ancestral seat, Blenheim Palace, was one of England's most magnificent country houses, but it was also crumbling from decades of deferred maintenance and mounting debts. The Duke's financial situation was so dire that he had little choice but to consider marriage to an American heiress, regardless of personal compatibility. This wasn't unusual among British aristocracy of the period, many of whom viewed such marriages as business arrangements that would benefit both parties. The Americans would gain titles and social standing, while the British would gain the funds necessary to maintain their heritage and lifestyle. But Charles Spencer Churchill was not merely a fortune hunter. He was an intelligent, cultured man who understood the responsibilities that came with his position. He took his duties as Duke seriously and was genuinely committed to preserving both his family's legacy and the welfare of the tenants and communities that depended on his estates. In different circumstances, he might have made an excellent husband for someone who shared his interests and understood his world. The tragedy was that neither he nor Consuelo had any real choice in the matter. Both were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, forced into a relationship that served everyone's interests except their own. The negotiations between their families proceeded like a corporate merger, with lawyers and financial advisors working out the details of settlements, dowries, and inheritance arrangements, while the two people most affected by these decisions remained largely on the sidelines. Consuelo's final capitulation came after months of relentless pressure that had worn down her resistance and damaged her health. The exact moment when she agreed to the marriage has been debated by historians, but her own later writing suggests that it was less a conscious decision than a kind of psychological collapse. She had fought as long and as hard as she could within the constraints of her upbringing and social position, but ultimately found herself overwhelmed by forces much larger than herself. The announcement of the engagement created a sensation in both American and British society. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic covered every detail of the upcoming union, portraying it as a romantic fairy tale rather than the business arrangement it actually was. The press focused on the glamorous aspects of the match: the bride's beauty and fortune, the groom's title and ancestral home, the magnificent wedding that was being planned. What the newspapers didn't report was the human cost of these arrangements. They didn't mention Consuelo's obvious unhappiness during the engagement period, or the Duke's own reservations about the match. They certainly didn't explore the broader implications of a system that treated young women as valuable commodities to be traded for social and financial advantage. The wedding preparations became a spectacle that consumed months and involved hundreds of people. Alva threw herself into the planning with the same single-minded determination she had shown in pursuing the match itself. Every detail had to be perfect, every element designed to showcase the Vanderbilt family's wealth and taste, while also demonstrating their new connection to British aristocracy. The wedding dress alone cost more than most families earned in several years. Made of white satin and adorned with pearls and precious stones, it was a masterpiece of craftsmanship that took months to complete. But for Consuelo, being fitted for this dress was a form of torture. Each session a reminder of the life she was about to enter and the love she was being forced to abandon. The guest list read like a who's who of American high society and European nobility. Presidents and princes, industrialists and aristocrats all gathered to witness what was being hailed as the wedding of the century. The ceremony itself took place at St. Thomas Church in New York City, which had been transformed into a bower of flowers and decorated with enough candles to illuminate a small city. But perhaps the most telling detail of that November day in 1895 was something that none of the newspapers reported. As Consuelo walked down the aisle toward her future husband, tears were streaming down her face. The assembled guests and reporters interpreted these as tears of joy, but Consuelo herself later revealed that they were tears of grief for the life she was leaving behind and the love she was being forced to sacrifice. The Duke, waiting at the altar, was himself struggling with his own emotions. He was not a cruel man, and he understood that this marriage was as difficult for his bride as it was for him. But he also understood that both of their futures depended on making the best of a situation that neither had chosen. His own letters from this period reveal a man trying to convince himself that duty and compatibility could eventually grow into something resembling happiness. After the ceremony, the newlyweds embarked on a honeymoon that took them across Europe before finally arriving at Blenheim Palace, Consuelo's new home. The palace was even more magnificent than she had imagined, with hundreds of rooms, priceless art collections, and gardens that stretched to the horizon. But it was also cold, formal, and completely alien to everything she had known in her relatively informal American upbringing. The adjustment to British aristocratic life proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Consuelo had to learn not just the complex protocols and traditions of her new social position, but also how to manage a vast household staff, navigate the intricate relationships between different noble families, and fulfill the countless obligations that came with being a duchess. More difficult still was learning to live with a husband who remained essentially a stranger to her. The Duke was unfailingly polite and correct in his behavior, but there was little warmth or intimacy between them. They moved through their daily routines like actors in a play, performing their roles competently, but without genuine connection or affection. The early years of the marriage were marked by a kind of resigned cooperation. Both Consuelo and the Duke understood their obligations and worked to fulfill them as honorably as possible. They entertained extensively, traveled in appropriate social circles, and eventually produced 2 sons to carry on the family line. From the outside, their marriage appeared successful and harmonious. But Consuelo's private writings from this period tell a different story. She described feeling like a prisoner in golden chains, surrounded by luxury but starved of genuine human connection. She missed America desperately, not just the places and people she had known, but the relative freedom and informality that had characterized her life there. In England, every moment of her day was governed by protocol and tradition, leaving little space for spontaneity or personal expression. The Duke, for his part, was dealing with his own struggles. The financial arrangements of the marriage had indeed saved his estates, but the pressure of living up to his new wife's expectations, while also maintaining his traditional way of life, created constant tension. He had his own interests and pursuits that didn't necessarily align with Consuelo's, and the effort to maintain harmony while preserving his independence proved exhausting. What made their situation particularly poignant was that both were fundamentally decent people, trapped in an impossible situation. Neither had wanted to hurt the other, but the circumstances of their marriage made genuine happiness nearly impossible to achieve. They were like 2 actors forced to perform in a play they hadn't chosen, speaking lines written by others while their authentic selves remained hidden behind the roles they were required to play. As the years passed, both began to find small ways to assert their independence within the constraints of their positions. The Duke pursued his political interests and scholarly pursuits with increasing dedication, while Consuelo began to involve herself in charitable work that gave her a sense of purpose and connection to the wider world beyond aristocratic society. These separate pursuits eventually began to create the space that would allow them to develop into the individuals they were meant to be, rather than the roles they had been forced to assume. But this growth would also make the fundamental incompatibility of their marriage increasingly difficult to ignore, setting the stage for the dramatic changes that would define the next chapter of both their lives. The transformation that both Consuelo and the Duke underwent during these years of enforced coexistence reveals something profound about human resilience and adaptability. While their marriage remained fundamentally hollow, both began to discover aspects of themselves that might never have emerged under different circumstances. Consuelo, who had been raised to be ornamental and obedient, found herself developing genuine expertise in areas that mattered to her. The Duke, who had married primarily for financial necessity, began to appreciate qualities in his wife that had nothing to do with her dowry. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was Consuelo's growing awareness of the broader world beyond the privileged circles she had always inhabited. Her charitable work brought her into contact with people whose lives were shaped by poverty, illness, and social injustice rather than protocol and precedents. These experiences awakened something in her that had been dormant throughout her carefully controlled upbringing, a sense of purpose that came from her own convictions rather than other people's expectations. The contrast between her public duties as a duchess and her private work among London's poor created a kind of double consciousness that would profoundly influence the rest of her life. In the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, she played her assigned role with increasing skill and confidence. But in the hospitals and charitable institutions where she volunteered, she began to discover who she might have become if her life had been her own to shape. This growing sense of authenticity inevitably created tension with the artificial constraints of her marriage and social position. The more real purpose she found in her charitable work, the more hollow her ceremonial duties began to feel. The more she developed genuine relationships with people who valued her for her actions rather than her title, the more isolated she felt within her own household. The Duke was experiencing his own parallel awakening. His political career was flourishing, and he was gaining recognition for his intelligence and integrity rather than merely his inherited position. Like his wife, he was discovering capabilities and interests that extended far beyond the narrow confines of aristocratic tradition. But this personal growth only highlighted the fundamental incompatibility that lay at the heart of their relationship. Both were becoming more fully themselves, but the selves they were becoming had little in common beyond mutual respect and shared obligations. They were like two plants that had been forced to grow in the same pot, but were now reaching toward entirely different sources of light. The space between them wasn't filled with hostility or cruelty, but with a kind of profound loneliness that no amount of wealth or status could remedy. The breaking point came not through any dramatic confrontation or betrayal, but through the gradual accumulation of small moments when both realized they were living parallel lives rather than a shared one. They could maintain the facade of a successful marriage indefinitely, but the cost was becoming too high for both of them. The energy required to suppress their authentic selves in service of social expectations was draining them of the vitality they needed to pursue the work and relationships that actually mattered to them. What makes their situation particularly tragic is that in a different time or under different circumstances, they might have found ways to honor both their public obligations and their private needs. But the rigid social conventions of their era allowed little flexibility for couples who discovered that duty and happiness were incompatible. They were trapped not just by their own choices, but by an entire system that prioritized appearance over substance and stability over growth. The first cracks in their public facade began to appear during social gatherings, where their separate interests and personalities became too obvious to ignore. Friends and relatives started to notice that they rarely seemed to enjoy each other's company, that their conversations were polite but superficial, and that they increasingly pursued separate activities and friendships. The gossip that began to circulate wasn't malicious, but it reflected a growing awareness that all was not as it seemed in what had once been portrayed as a fairy tale marriage. Consuelo's correspondence from this period reveals a woman struggling with questions that had no easy answers. She had fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, had played her role as Duchess with grace and competence, and had even produced the required heirs to continue the family line. By every external measure, she had succeeded brilliantly, yet she felt increasingly empty and disconnected from her own life. The Duke's private writings show a similar struggle. He had saved his family's estates, had established himself as a serious political figure and had maintained the dignity and traditions of his ancient house. He had been a responsible husband and father, had treated his wife with consistent courtesy and respect, and had honored all the obligations that came with his position, but he too felt that something essential was missing from his life. Both began to realize that they had been so focused on meeting external expectations that they had never really gotten to know each other as individuals. Their relationship had been built on roles and responsibilities rather than genuine compatibility or affection. They were like actors who had been performing the same play for so many years that they had forgotten there was a world beyond the theatre. This realization led to conversations between them that were both painful and liberating. For perhaps the first time since their engagement, they spoke honestly about their feelings, their disappointments, and their hopes for the future. These discussions didn't bring them closer together romantically, but they did establish a foundation of mutual understanding and respect that would serve them well in the difficult years ahead. The decision to formally separate wasn't made lightly or quickly. Both understood the social and legal complications that would follow, as well as the impact on their children and families. Divorce was still scandalous in their circles, and the process would inevitably involve public scrutiny and private pain for everyone involved. But they had reached a point where continuing the pretense felt more damaging than facing the consequences of honesty. What's remarkable about their eventual separation is how they managed to maintain their friendship and mutual respect throughout the process. Neither blamed the other for the failure of their marriage, understanding that they had both been victims of circumstances beyond their control. They worked together to minimize the impact on their sons and to handle the legal and financial arrangements with as much dignity and fairness as possible. The public reaction to their separation was intense and largely predictable. Society gossip seized on every detail, often inventing scandals where none existed. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic covered the story extensively, usually focusing on the sensational aspects rather than the human complexities involved. Many people who had celebrated their wedding as a triumph now treated their separation as a moral failing, but there were also voices of understanding and support, particularly among women who recognized the courage it took for Consuelo to choose authenticity over social acceptance. Her decision to prioritize her own well-being over external expectations was seen by some as a betrayal of her class and position, but by others as a necessary assertion of individual dignity and worth. The legal proceedings were complicated by the international nature of their marriage and the complex financial arrangements that had been made at the time of their wedding. Both British and American lawyers were involved, and the negotiations over property, custody, and financial support took months to resolve. Throughout this process, both Consuelo and the Duke maintained their commitment to handling the matter with as much grace and privacy as possible. When the divorce was finally granted, it represented more than just the end of a marriage. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in Consuelo's life, one in which she would finally have the opportunity to discover who she might become when freed from the constraints that had shaped her since childhood. The woman who emerged from this experience was stronger, wiser, and more determined than anyone, including herself, might have expected. The impact of their divorce extended far beyond their immediate families. It became a symbol of changing attitudes toward marriage, individual rights, and social conventions. Other unhappy couples in similar situations took note of their example, and the rigid expectations that had governed aristocratic marriages began to show signs of flexibility and evolution. For Consuelo personally, the end of her first marriage represented both an ending and a beginning. She had lost the security and status that came with being a duchess, but she had gained something far more valuable: the freedom to live according to her own values and desires. The woman who had once been treated as a valuable commodity now had the opportunity to discover her own worth on her own terms. The years following her divorce would prove to be among the most fulfilling and productive of her life. Free from the constraints of her aristocratic role, she threw herself into charitable work with renewed energy and purpose. She also began to explore interests and relationships that had been impossible during her marriage, gradually building a life that reflected her authentic self rather than other people's expectations. But perhaps most importantly, her experience served as a powerful example for other women of her generation who were struggling with similar constraints and expectations. Her courage in choosing personal authenticity over social conformity helped to pave the way for broader changes in how women's roles and rights were understood and valued. The story of Consuelo's first marriage and its dissolution illuminates the broader experiences of Gilded Age women who found themselves caught between traditional expectations and emerging possibilities for individual fulfillment. These women lived at a pivotal moment in history when the old certainties were beginning to crack, but new freedoms had not yet fully emerged. Many of Consuelo's contemporaries faced similar dilemmas, though not all had the resources or courage to make the choices she ultimately made. Some found ways to create meaningful lives within the constraints of unsatisfying marriages, channeling their energy into charitable work, artistic pursuits, or intellectual endeavors that provided some measure of personal fulfillment. Others endured in silence, sacrificing their own happiness for the sake of family honor and social stability. What united these women was their shared experience of living in a world that valued them primarily for their ability to enhance their family's social and financial position. They were educated and cultured, often more so than their male contemporaries, but their education was designed to make them attractive wives rather than independent individuals. They were surrounded by luxury and privilege, but these advantages came with strings attached that limited their freedom in fundamental ways. The charitable work that many of these women pursued wasn't just a socially acceptable way to spend their time. It was often their only opportunity to exercise real authority and make meaningful decisions. Through their involvement in hospitals, schools, and social reform organizations, they could develop skills and relationships that existed outside the narrow confines of their domestic roles. These experiences often awakened ambitions and capabilities that had been suppressed by their upbringing and social expectations. Women who had been raised to be decorative discovered they had talents for organization, leadership, and advocacy. Those who had been taught to defer to male authority found they could be effective decision makers and problem solvers when given the opportunity. The tension between these emerging capabilities and the constraints of their traditional roles created internal conflicts that many found difficult to resolve. They were caught between loyalty to family expectations and growing awareness of their own potential, between the security of conventional roles and the uncertainty of uncharted possibilities. Consuelo's story during this period becomes even more compelling when we consider the specific ways that Gilded Age society controlled and monitored women's behavior. The social rules governing wealthy women were incredibly detailed and restrictive, covering everything from whom they could speak to at parties to how they could spend their own money. These weren't just suggestions or guidelines, but rigid expectations that were ruthlessly enforced through social ostracism and family pressure. The daily routine of a woman in Consuelo's position was choreographed down to the smallest detail. Morning calls had specific time limits and protocols. Afternoon entertainments required particular types of dress and conversation. Evening social events involved complex hierarchies of precedence that determined everything from seating arrangements to the order in which people entered and left rooms. A single misstep could result in weeks of social gossip and potential damage to the family's reputation. What made these restrictions particularly suffocating was that they were presented as privileges rather than limitations. Women were told they were being protected and honored by these elaborate systems of control. The gilded cage was decorated so beautifully that many forgot they were trapped inside it. The servants, the jewels, the magnificent homes, and the constant attention were supposed to compensate for the complete lack of personal autonomy. But Consuelo was beginning to see through this facade. Her charitable work had shown her women who possessed far less material wealth but far more freedom to make their own choices. She met women who worked for wages, who made their own decisions about marriage and family, who could travel without chaperones and speak their minds without fear of social consequences. The contrast was stark and increasingly painful. The irony wasn't lost on her that as one of the wealthiest women in the world, she had less freedom than a shop girl or a factory worker. Those women might struggle financially, but they could choose their own husbands, pursue their own interests, and express their own opinions without risking everything they held dear. Consuelo's wealth, rather than liberating her, had become the very instrument of her imprisonment. This realization led her to begin questioning other aspects of the system she had been born into. She started to notice how the marriages of her friends and acquaintances followed the same patterns as her own. Love matches were rare among her social circle, and when they did occur, they were often viewed with suspicion or even contempt. The idea that personal happiness should be a factor in marriage was considered naive and selfish. The children of these arranged marriages often grew up in households where their parents maintained polite but distant relationships. Genuine affection between spouses was so unusual that it was remarked upon as extraordinary when it did exist. This emotional coldness wasn't seen as a problem to be solved, but simply as the natural order of things among people of their class. Consuelo began to realize that her own unhappiness wasn't a personal failing or a stroke of bad luck, but the inevitable result of a system that prioritized financial and social considerations over human compatibility. She wasn't uniquely unfortunate. She was simply experiencing what most women in her position experienced, though few were willing to acknowledge it openly. This understanding gave her both comfort and determination. She wasn't alone in her struggles, and more importantly, her dissatisfaction wasn't evidence of ingratitude or moral weakness. She was responding normally to an abnormal situation, and the fault lay with the system rather than with her inability to adapt to it successfully. The friendships she began to cultivate during this period of awakening were different from the relationships she had known before. Instead of the careful, superficial connections typical of her social circle, she sought out women who shared her growing interest in social reform and individual authenticity. These relationships were based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than social position or family connections. Through these new friendships, Consuelo discovered that there were other women from wealthy families who were quietly questioning the assumptions that governed their lives. They met in small groups to discuss books, ideas, and social issues that went far beyond the usual topics of conversation in their circles. These gatherings became a kind of informal education in possibilities that none of them had been taught to consider. The books they read together opened windows onto different ways of thinking about women's roles and capabilities. They studied the works of early feminists and social reformers, learning about women who had challenged conventional expectations and created meaningful lives outside traditional domestic roles. These examples gave them models for imagining different futures for themselves. But perhaps most importantly, these discussions helped them develop the vocabulary and conceptual framework they needed to articulate their own experiences and desires. Many of them had felt vague dissatisfaction with their lives, but lacked the words to explain what was missing or what they wanted instead. Through conversation and reading, they learned to name their feelings and identify their aspirations. The process of intellectual and emotional awakening wasn't without its costs. The more clearly Consuelo could see the limitations of her current life, the more difficult it became to maintain the facade of contentment that was expected of her. The gap between her public role and her private thoughts created a kind of internal tension that was exhausting to sustain. Her relationship with her mother became increasingly strained during this period. Alva had worked so hard to secure what she considered the perfect life for her daughter, and Consuelo's obvious unhappiness felt like both an accusation and an ingratitude. Alva couldn't understand how someone who had everything she herself had dreamed of could be anything but grateful and satisfied. The generational divide between mother and daughter reflected broader changes happening in society. Alva's generation had fought to gain access to the highest levels of social prestige and financial security. They had succeeded in ways that their own mothers could never have imagined, and they expected their daughters to appreciate and build upon these achievements. But Consuelo's generation was asking different questions. Having achieved material success and social position, they were beginning to wonder whether these accomplishments were worth the personal costs involved. They had been given everything except the freedom to choose their own paths. And increasingly, that freedom seemed more valuable than all the privileges they possessed. This shift in values wasn't happening in isolation. The broader culture was beginning to change as well, though slowly and unevenly. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. New educational opportunities were opening up for women, and traditional assumptions about gender roles were being questioned in various contexts. These larger social changes provided support and validation for women like Consuelo, who were struggling with their own personal constraints. The charitable organizations where Consuelo volunteered were themselves evolving during this period. What had once been primarily social activities for wealthy women were becoming more professional and systematic in their approaches to social problems. Women who had initially gotten involved to occupy their time respectably were discovering that they had genuine talents for administration, fundraising, and advocacy. These organizations provided a space where women could exercise real authority and see concrete results from their efforts. The skills they developed through charitable work, organization, leadership, and public speaking were exactly the capabilities they had been denied opportunities to use in their personal lives. The contrast was both liberating and frustrating. Consuelo found herself increasingly effective and confident in her charitable work while feeling more constrained than ever in her domestic role. She could successfully manage complex projects involving dozens of volunteers and thousands of dollars, but she couldn't make basic decisions about her own daily schedule without consulting her husband and considering the social implications of her choices. This contradiction highlighted the arbitrary nature of the restrictions placed on women of her class. The same society that insisted women were too delicate and irrational to participate in business or politics relied heavily on their organizational abilities and sound judgment when it came to charitable enterprises. Women who were supposedly incapable of understanding complex issues managed hospitals, schools, and social service programs with remarkable effectiveness. The recognition of this contradiction was both empowering and infuriating. It proved that the limitations placed on women weren't based on actual incapacity, but on social conventions designed to maintain existing power structures. The revelation that she was perfectly capable of independent thought and action made her current constraints feel even more artificial and unjust. As Consuelo's confidence grew through her charitable work, she began to apply the same analytical skills to her own situation that she used in addressing social problems. She started to see her marriage not as a personal failure, but as a symptom of a larger systemic issue. The same clear thinking that made her effective in her volunteer work helped her understand the forces that had shaped her life and limited her choices. This intellectual framework gave her the tools she needed to begin planning for change. Instead of simply feeling trapped and unhappy, she could identify specific problems and imagine potential solutions. The skills she had developed in charitable work, strategic thinking, resource management, and coalition building proved directly applicable to the challenge of reshaping her own life. The network of relationships she had built through her volunteer activities also provided crucial support as she contemplated major changes. These women understood her situation in ways that her family and traditional social circle could not. They had seen her capabilities and respected her judgment, and their support gave her the confidence she needed to trust her own instincts about what her life could become. The gradual process of awakening and preparation that Consuelo underwent during these years illustrates the complex ways that social change happens. Individual transformation and broader cultural shifts reinforced each other, creating possibilities that hadn't existed before. Her personal journey was both shaped by and contributed to larger movements toward greater freedom and equality for women. But the path from recognition to action wasn't straightforward or easy. Understanding that change was possible was only the first step. The actual process of breaking free from the constraints that had shaped her entire life would require courage, resources, and determination that would test every aspect of her character. The comfortable but suffocating world she knew would have to be abandoned before she could discover what might be possible in its place. The decision to pursue separation and eventual divorce represented not just a personal choice, but a kind of public statement about women's rights to self-determination. In a society that treated marriage as a permanent business arrangement, the idea that a woman might choose to leave an unsatisfying but socially successful marriage was revolutionary. Consuelo's choice to prioritize personal authenticity over social expectations challenged fundamental assumptions about women's roles and responsibilities. The legal and social obstacles she faced in pursuing divorce were formidable. The laws governing marriage and divorce strongly favored men, particularly in matters of property and child custody. A woman who left her marriage, regardless of the reasons, risked losing access to her children, her financial security, and her social position. These weren't idle threats, but real consequences that many women had experienced. The social stigma attached to divorce was equally daunting. Divorced women were often treated as moral failures, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the breakdown of their marriages. They faced exclusion from many social activities and were viewed with suspicion by married women who saw them as potential threats to their own relationships. The isolation and judgment could be overwhelming, but Consuelo had advantages that many women lacked. Her family's wealth provided her with legal resources and financial independence that made divorce more feasible than it would have been for someone with fewer resources. Her charitable work had given her a network of supportive relationships outside her traditional social circle. Most importantly, her intellectual and emotional development had given her the clarity and confidence she needed to pursue a difficult course of action. The process of actually ending her marriage was complicated by the international nature of her situation. British and American legal systems had different approaches to divorce, and the complex financial arrangements that had been made at the time of her marriage created additional complications. The negotiations were lengthy and often contentious, requiring patience and persistence from everyone involved. Throughout this difficult period, both Consuelo and the Duke maintained their commitment to treating each other with dignity and respect. Neither sought to assign blame or create unnecessary difficulties for the other. Their ability to maintain their friendship during such a challenging process speaks well of both their characters and suggests that their marriage might have been successful under different circumstances. The public attention surrounding their divorce was intense and often sensationalized. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic covered every development in the case, usually with more focus on scandal than on the human complexities involved. Society gossip speculated endlessly about the reasons for the separation, often inventing dramatic stories that bore little resemblance to the reality of the situation. But there were also voices of support and understanding, particularly among women who recognized the courage required for Consuelo's decision. Her choice to prioritize her own well-being over social expectations was seen by some as selfish and irresponsible, but by others as a necessary assertion of individual dignity and worth. The mixed reactions reflected the broader cultural tensions surrounding changing roles for women. When the divorce was finally granted, it marked the end of one chapter of Consuelo's life and the beginning of another. The woman who emerged from this experience was fundamentally different from the 18-year-old girl who had walked down the aisle in tears 20 years earlier. She had learned to trust her own judgment, to value her own happiness, and to take responsibility for creating the life she wanted, rather than simply accepting what others chose for her. The transformation wasn't just personal, but also social. Consuelo's divorce became a symbol of changing attitudes toward marriage, individual rights, and women's autonomy. Other unhappy couples in similar situations took note of her example, and the rigid expectations that had governed aristocratic marriages began to show signs of flexibility and evolution. Her personal choice contributed to broader social changes that would benefit future generations of women. The years immediately following her divorce were both liberating and challenging. Consuelo had to learn how to live as an independent woman after decades of having her life managed by others. The freedom to make her own decisions was exhilarating, but also sometimes overwhelming. She had to develop new routines, new relationships, and new ways of understanding herself outside the context of marriage and social obligation. Her charitable work became even more important during this period of transition. The organizations she had worked with provided continuity and purpose during a time when other aspects of her life were in flux. The skills and relationships she had developed through volunteer work proved invaluable as she navigated her new circumstances and explored new possibilities for her future. The financial arrangements resulting from her divorce gave her the independence she needed to pursue her own interests without having to depend on family approval or support. This economic freedom was crucial in allowing her to make choices based on her own values and desires rather than external pressures or constraints. The ability to support herself and her activities removed one of the major barriers that prevented many women from pursuing independent lives. But perhaps most importantly, her experience had given her a deep understanding of the constraints facing women of her generation and a commitment to helping others navigate similar challenges. The pain and struggle of her own journey had created empathy and insight that she could use to support other women who were questioning their own circumstances and considering their own possibilities for change. The network of relationships she had built through her charitable work and her process of personal transformation became the foundation for a new kind of life. These friendships were based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than social obligation or family connection. They provided the emotional support and intellectual stimulation that had been missing from her earlier relationships. Through these connections, Consuelo began to explore interests and activities that had been impossible during her marriage. She traveled more freely, pursuing destinations and experiences that appealed to her rather than those required by social convention. She read widely and engaged with ideas that challenged and expanded her understanding of the world. She formed relationships with people from diverse backgrounds who shared her interests in social reform and cultural development. The woman who emerged from this period of exploration and growth was confident, articulate, and purposeful in ways that would have been impossible within the constraints of her earlier life. She had discovered capabilities and interests that had been suppressed by her upbringing and social expectations. More importantly, she had learned to trust her own judgment and to value her own happiness as legitimate goals worthy of pursuit. Her transformation wasn't just individual, but also representative of broader changes happening among women of her generation and social class. The Gilded Age was giving way to new social realities that offered more opportunities for women to pursue education, careers, and independent lives. The rigid gender roles that had seemed natural and permanent were beginning to evolve in response to changing economic and social conditions. The charitable organizations that had provided outlets for wealthy women's energies were becoming more professional and influential. Women who had started as volunteers were becoming paid administrators and policy advocates. The skills they had developed through unpaid service were being recognized as valuable professional capabilities that deserved compensation and respect. Educational opportunities for women were expanding as well. Colleges and universities that had once excluded women entirely were beginning to admit them, and new institutions designed specifically for women's education were being established. These developments meant that younger women would have options that hadn't been available to Consuelo's generation. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum and public attention, challenging the assumption that women were naturally unsuited for political participation. The arguments and evidence being presented by suffrage advocates were forcing society to reconsider fundamental beliefs about women's capabilities and rights. These broader political changes provided context and support for individual women who were challenging constraints in their own lives. But change was neither universal nor uniform. Many women continued to find fulfillment within traditional roles, and many men and women actively resisted challenges to establish social arrangements. The tensions between old and new ways of thinking about gender roles created conflicts within families and communities that could be painful and divisive. Consuelo's story illustrates both the possibilities and the costs of choosing individual authenticity over social conformity during this period of transition. Her courage in prioritizing her own well-being over external expectations helped pave the way for broader changes in how women's roles and rights were understood and valued. But her choices also came with real sacrifices and difficulties that shouldn't be minimized or romanticized. The life she created for herself after her divorce wasn't perfect or without challenges, but it was authentically her own in ways that her earlier life had never been. She had learned to value her own judgment, to pursue her own interests, and to form relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than social obligation. These capabilities would serve her well in the years ahead as she continued to evolve and grow. The broader impact of her story extended far beyond her immediate circle. Her example provided inspiration and validation for other women who were struggling with similar constraints and questioning conventional expectations. Her success in creating a meaningful life outside traditional marriage challenged assumptions about what was possible or acceptable for women of her social class. The charitable and social reform work that she continued to pursue after her divorce demonstrated that women could make significant contributions to public life when given the opportunity. Her effectiveness in these areas provided evidence that the restrictions placed on women weren't based on natural incapacity, but on artificial social conventions that could and should be changed. Her relationships with her children, which she managed to maintain despite the complications of divorce, showed that it was possible for women to be devoted mothers while also pursuing their own interests and development. This example was particularly important in challenging the assumption that women had to choose between personal fulfillment and family responsibilities. The intellectual and cultural interests she pursued during her years of independence demonstrated the waste involved in restricting educated, capable women to purely domestic roles. Her contributions to various cultural and social organizations proved that society benefited when women were free to use their talents and capabilities more fully. But perhaps most importantly, her story revealed the human cost of social systems that prioritized family honor and financial advantage over individual happiness and compatibility. The pain and struggle she experienced weren't necessary consequences of wealth or social position, but results of specific social arrangements that could be changed through individual courage and collective action. The Gilded Age women who followed paths similar to Consuelo's helped create new possibilities for future generations. Their willingness to challenge expectations, to prioritize authenticity over approval, and to risk security for the chance of genuine fulfillment expanded the range of acceptable choices for women. Their struggles and sacrifices made it possible for their daughters and granddaughters to have options that hadn't existed before. The legacy of these women extends far beyond their immediate historical moment. The questions they raised about women's roles, the barriers they challenged, and the alternatives they created continued to influence social development long after their own lives had ended. Their courage in choosing difficult but authentic paths helped create the foundation for ongoing struggles for gender equality and individual freedom. Understanding their experiences provides insight not just into the past, but into the ongoing challenges of balancing individual desires with social expectations, personal authenticity with family obligations, and the pursuit of happiness with the maintenance of stability and security. These tensions weren't unique to the Gilded Age, but continue to shape human relationships and social arrangements in various forms today. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt and women like her reminds us that social change often begins with individual acts of courage, and that the personal choices made by ordinary people, even those with extraordinary privileges, can have far-reaching consequences for broader social development. Their willingness to question assumptions, to risk disapproval, and to pursue authentic lives helped create possibilities that we continue to benefit from today. The period following Consuelo's divorce marked not just a personal transformation, but the emergence of a woman who would become a powerful voice for social change. Free from the suffocating constraints of her aristocratic marriage, she discovered that the skills she had developed through years of charitable work could be applied on a much larger scale. What had begun as socially acceptable volunteer activities evolved into serious advocacy for women's rights, labor reform, and social justice. Her newfound independence allowed her to travel extensively, not as the dutiful wife accompanying her husband on diplomatic missions, but as an individual pursuing her own interests and investigations. She visited factories where young women worked in dangerous conditions for pennies a day. She toured tenement buildings where entire families crowded into single rooms. She observed firsthand the stark contrast between the gilded world she had inhabited and the harsh realities faced by the vast majority of society. These experiences profoundly shaped her understanding of privilege and responsibility. She began to see her wealth not as an entitlement or a burden, but as a tool that could be used to address systemic inequalities. The same fortune that had once felt like a prison became the means through which she could support causes and organizations that aligned with her evolving values. Her approach to philanthropy became more sophisticated and strategic during this period. Instead of simply writing checks or hosting fundraising events, she began to study the root causes of the social problems she wanted to address. She collaborated with social scientists, policy experts, and grassroots organizers to develop comprehensive approaches to complex issues. Her drawing rooms became meeting places where wealthy donors, academic researchers, and community activists could work together on shared goals. The transformation wasn't always smooth or comfortable. Many of her former friends and family members struggled to understand her new priorities and activities. The woman who had once been content to discuss fashion and social gossip now wanted to debate labor legislation and women's suffrage. Some viewed her evolution as admirable, others as a betrayal of her class and upbringing. Her relationship with her mother, Alva, became particularly complicated during this period. Alva had always been strong-willed and ambitious, but her ambitions had been channeled through traditional means, advantageous marriages, magnificent homes, and social prominence. She struggled to understand why her daughter would risk the security and status she had worked so hard to secure in pursuit of uncertain and potentially controversial goals. The generational divide between mother and daughter reflected broader tensions within American society. The older generation had focused on accumulating wealth and establishing social position. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, creating fortunes and lifestyles that rivaled those of European royalty. But their children were beginning to question whether material success was sufficient, whether there might be more meaningful ways to use their advantages. Consuelo's evolving relationship with her children also illustrated these changing values. As a duchess, she had been expected to maintain a certain distance from her sons, leaving their daily care to nurses and governesses while focusing on her social obligations. But as an independent woman, she chose to be more directly involved in their upbringing. Despite the unconventional nature of her situation, she wanted her children to understand both the privileges and the responsibilities that came with their position. She exposed them to different social environments and encouraged them to develop empathy for people whose lives were very different from their own. Her approach to parenting reflected her belief that wealth and status should be used for positive social impact rather than mere personal gratification. The legal complexities surrounding her divorce had also given her insights into the ways that existing laws disadvantaged women. She began to support organizations working for legal reform, particularly around issues of marriage, divorce, and property rights. Her own experience navigating the legal system had shown her how difficult it was for women to protect their interests, even when they had significant resources and capable legal representation. Her advocacy work brought her into contact with women from very different backgrounds, who were fighting similar battles for autonomy and recognition. She developed relationships with suffragettes, labor organizers, and social reformers who challenged her thinking and expanded her understanding of the interconnected nature of various social issues. These collaborations were intellectually stimulating and emotionally fulfilling in ways that her previous social relationships had never been. The skills she had developed during her years as a duchess proved surprisingly valuable in her new role as a social advocate. The ability to navigate complex social situations, to manage large events, and to communicate effectively with people from different backgrounds served her well in organizing campaigns and building coalitions. Her experience with protocol and diplomacy helped her work effectively with government officials and other influential figures. But perhaps most importantly, her personal story gave her credibility and authenticity that pure activists sometimes lacked. She could speak about the limitations facing wealthy women not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who had lived those constraints and found ways to transcend them. Her willingness to sacrifice security and social acceptance for the sake of personal integrity resonated with women who were facing similar choices in their own lives. The press coverage of her activities during this period reflected the broader cultural tensions surrounding changing roles for women. Some newspapers portrayed her as a courageous pioneer, blazing new trails for women's independence. Others criticized her as a selfish woman who had abandoned her proper duties and responsibilities. The intensity of these reactions suggested that her choices touched on fundamental anxieties about social change and gender roles. Her romantic life also became a subject of public fascination and speculation. The idea that a divorced woman might pursue new relationships was scandalous to some and inspiring to others. She handled this attention with the same dignity and discretion that had characterized her approach to her divorce, refusing to let public opinion dictate her personal choices, while also being mindful of the impact her actions might have on her children and her work. When she eventually remarried, her choice of partner reflected her transformed priorities and values. Instead of another aristocratic marriage arranged for social and financial advantage, she chose a relationship based on genuine compatibility and shared interests. Her second husband was someone who supported her work and independence, rather than viewing them as threats to his own position or authority. This marriage was everything her first had not been. A partnership between equals, who respected each other's individual goals and ambitions, while also sharing common values and interests. The contrast between her two marriages illustrated the difference between relationships based on social convention and those built on authentic connection and mutual support. The success of her second marriage also challenged prevailing assumptions about divorce and remarriage. Critics had predicted that her rejection of her first marriage would make her incapable of finding happiness in any relationship. Instead, her experience suggested that ending an incompatible marriage might actually increase the chances of forming a successful partnership later in life. Her work during the suffrage movement became particularly significant as the campaign for women's voting rights intensified. She used her social connections, her organizational skills, and her financial resources to support the cause in various ways. She hosted strategy meetings, funded publications, and personally lobbied legislators and other influential figures. Her involvement in suffrage work brought her into contact with women from all social classes, who were united by their shared commitment to political equality. These relationships challenged any remaining assumptions she might have had about class differences and social hierarchies. She discovered that intelligence, dedication, and moral courage could be found in any social stratum, and were not necessarily correlated with wealth or education. The suffrage campaign also provided her with a concrete goal around which to organize her various interests and activities. The fight for voting rights connected to many of the other issues she cared about: legal equality, economic justice, educational opportunity, and social reform. Supporting suffrage became a way of addressing multiple interconnected problems simultaneously. The strategic thinking required for effective political advocacy drew on all the skills she had developed throughout her life. Her understanding of social dynamics helped her identify key influences and build effective coalitions. Her experience with public speaking and event management proved invaluable in organizing rallies and campaigns. Her financial resources allowed her to support activities that might not have been possible otherwise. But beyond her practical contributions, her participation in the suffrage movement represented something symbolically important. Here was a woman who had once been treated as a valuable commodity in the marriage market, now demanding full political citizenship and equality. Her transformation from passive object to active agent of change embodied the broader aspirations of the women's rights movement. The opposition she encountered during her advocacy work was sometimes intense and personal. Critics attacked not just her positions on various issues, but her character, her motives, and her fitness as a woman and mother. These attacks were designed to discourage her from continuing her work by making the personal costs too high to bear, but her experience had taught her to distinguish between legitimate criticism and malicious attacks designed to silence her. She had learned to value her own judgment over public opinion, and to pursue goals she believed in regardless of external pressure. The same inner strength that had enabled her to leave her marriage now sustained her through the challenges of public advocacy. Her resilience in the face of criticism also inspired other women who were considering similar paths. Seeing someone from her background weather attacks and continue her work demonstrated that it was possible to survive and even thrive while challenging conventional expectations. Her example provided both practical guidance and emotional encouragement for others facing similar decisions. The organizations she supported and helped build during this period outlasted her own involvement and continued to influence social policy for decades. Her investment in institutional change, rather than just individual charity, created lasting impact that extended far beyond what she could have accomplished through personal generosity alone. The foundations, advocacy groups, and educational institutions she helped establish continued to advance the causes she cared about long after her death. Her approach to social change emphasized the importance of working within existing systems while also challenging their limitations. She used her social connections and financial resources to gain access to decision makers, but she also supported grassroots organizing and direct action when necessary. This combination of insider influence and outsider pressure proved more effective than either approach alone. The international dimension of her work also reflected her unique position and experiences. Her connections to both American and British society gave her insights into different approaches to social problems and policy solutions. She could compare systems and practices across national boundaries and advocate for the adoption of successful innovations, regardless of their origin. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman who was intellectually engaged, emotionally fulfilled, and purposefully directed in ways that had been impossible during her years as a duchess. She wrote about her work with enthusiasm and conviction, describing challenges and setbacks with the same analytical clarity she brought to successes and achievements. Her letters show someone who had found her authentic voice and was using it to advance causes she genuinely cared about. The network of relationships she built through her advocacy work became one of the most valuable aspects of her transformed life. Unlike the superficial connections of her earlier social world, these relationships were based on shared commitments and mutual respect. The friendships she formed with fellow activists, reformers, and intellectuals provided intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and collaborative opportunities that enriched every aspect of her existence. Her homes during this period reflected her changed priorities and interests. Instead of showcasing wealth and status through elaborate decoration and formal entertaining, she created spaces that facilitated meaningful conversation and productive work. Her drawing rooms became informal headquarters for various causes and campaigns, while her libraries reflected her serious engagement with contemporary social and political issues. The contrast between her earlier and later domestic arrangements illustrated the evolution of her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. The magnificent but cold formality of Blenheim Palace had been replaced by more modest but warmer environments that reflected her personality and supported her activities. The change represented a conscious choice to prioritize substance over appearance and authenticity over convention. Her financial independence allowed her to make these choices without having to consider anyone else's preferences or requirements. The settlements from her divorce provided her with sufficient resources to live comfortably while also supporting the causes she cared about. This economic freedom was crucial in enabling her to maintain her independence and pursue her own goals without compromise. But she also understood that her financial advantages came with responsibilities. She viewed her wealth as a trust that should be used for positive social impact rather than mere personal gratification. This philosophy guided her spending decisions and shaped her approach to both daily living and major philanthropic commitments. Her relationship with money itself had been transformed by her experiences. As a young woman, wealth had been both a privilege and a burden, providing luxury while also creating constraints and obligations. But as an independent woman, she learned to view money as a tool that could be used strategically to advance goals she believed in. The same fortune that had once felt like a prison became the means through which she could support meaningful change. The educational opportunities she pursued during her years of independence reflected her hunger for intellectual growth and development. She attended lectures, participated in study groups, and engaged with contemporary thinkers who challenged her assumptions and expanded her understanding of complex social issues. This ongoing education compensated for the limitations of her earlier training, which had focused on social accomplishments rather than serious intellectual development. Her engagement with academic and intellectual communities also provided her with frameworks for understanding the problems she was trying to address. Instead of approaching social issues through pure emotion or intuition, she learned to analyze root causes, evaluate different solutions, and measure the effectiveness of various interventions. This analytical approach made her advocacy work more strategic and impactful. The writing she began to do during this period represented another form of independence and self-expression. Her articles and essays on social issues allowed her to articulate her thoughts and experiences in ways that could influence public opinion and policy debates. Her unique perspective as someone who had moved between different social worlds gave her insights that pure activists or academics might lack. Her public speaking engagements became increasingly sophisticated and effective as she gained experience and confidence. The same social skills that had served her as a duchess proved valuable in different contexts, allowing her to communicate effectively with diverse audiences and build support for the causes she championed. Her ability to bridge different social worlds made her particularly effective at building coalitions and generating broad-based support. The recognition she received for her advocacy work provided validation that had been missing from her earlier accomplishments. The praise she earned for her social reform activities was based on her own efforts and achievements rather than her family connections or marriage arrangements. This recognition affirmed her sense of individual worth and capability in ways that social status alone had never provided. But perhaps most importantly, her work during this period gave her a sense of purpose and meaning that had been absent from her earlier life. Instead of simply fulfilling expectations or playing assigned roles, she was actively working to address problems she cared about and to create positive change in the world. This sense of agency and impact provided fulfillment that no amount of wealth or status could have generated. The legacy she created through her advocacy work extended far beyond her own lifetime. The organizations she supported, the policies she helped influence, and the example she provided for other women continued to have impact long after her death. Her transformation from passive object to active agent of change demonstrated possibilities that inspired future generations of women to challenge limitations and pursue their own goals. Her story also contributed to broader cultural conversations about women's roles, individual autonomy, and social responsibility. The choices she made and the life she created challenged assumptions about what was possible or appropriate for women of her background and generation. Her example helped expand the range of acceptable options for wealthy women, while also demonstrating that privilege could be used for positive social impact. The courage she displayed in leaving her marriage, pursuing her own interests, and advocating for social change required her to risk everything she had been taught to value. The fact that she not only survived these risks, but thrived in her new life provided powerful evidence that authenticity and individual fulfillment were goals worth pursuing even at significant personal cost. Understanding her journey from constrained heiress to independent advocate illuminates the broader experiences of Gilded Age women who found themselves caught between traditional expectations and emerging possibilities. These women lived at a pivotal moment when old certainties were being questioned, but new freedoms had not yet been fully established. Their individual choices and collective actions helped shape the transition toward greater equality and opportunity for future generations. The world that Consuelo Vanderbilt inhabited and helped transform was one where women's lives were circumscribed by countless invisible barriers that seemed natural and permanent, but were actually artificial constructions that could be challenged and changed. Her life story demonstrates both the power of individual courage and the importance of broader social movements in creating possibilities for human flourishing that transcend the limitations of birth, class, and gender. The women of Consuelo's era faced a paradox that defined much of their existence. They possessed unprecedented material advantages while simultaneously being denied basic personal autonomy. This contradiction created internal tensions that many found difficult to resolve, but it also generated the energy and motivation needed to challenge existing arrangements and create new possibilities for themselves and future generations. The elaborate social machinery that governed the lives of wealthy women during the Gilded Age was designed to maintain stability and continuity, but it also stifled individual development and wasted human potential on a massive scale. The same system that produced magnificent mansions and elaborate social rituals also prevented talented, educated women from contributing their capabilities to broader social and cultural development. The charitable work that provided acceptable outlets for women's energies often became the means through which they discovered their own capabilities and developed the confidence needed to challenge other limitations in their lives. What began as socially sanctioned volunteer activities evolved into serious professional expertise that demanded recognition and respect from the broader society. The international marriages that characterized this era created unique opportunities for cultural exchange and social comparison, but they also highlighted the universal nature of restrictions placed on women, regardless of national boundaries or cultural traditions. Women who moved between American and European societies could observe different approaches to similar problems and advocate for the adoption of progressive innovations. The transformation of individual women, like Consuelo, was both a cause and a consequence of broader social changes that were reshaping American society during this period. The industrial economy that had created vast fortunes was also creating new opportunities for women in education, employment, and public life. The same forces that had made possible the elaborate lifestyle of the Gilded Age elite were also undermining the social arrangements that had sustained traditional gender roles. The courage displayed by women who chose to challenge conventional expectations, despite significant personal and social costs, demonstrated that change was possible, even under the most restrictive circumstances. Their willingness to risk security, status, and approval for the sake of authenticity and individual fulfillment created examples that inspired others to question their own situations and consider alternative possibilities. The legacy of the Gilded Age women who pioneered new roles and challenged traditional limitations extends far beyond their immediate historical moment. The questions they raised, the barriers they challenged, and the alternatives they created continued to influence social development throughout the 20th century and into our contemporary world. Their struggles and achievements remind us that social progress depends on individuals who are willing to risk comfort and conformity for the sake of broader human flourishing. The networks of support and resistance that emerged around women like Consuelo during this transformative period reveal the complex social dynamics that either facilitated or hindered individual liberation. While some family members and friends viewed her choices as betrayals of everything they held sacred, others recognized her courage and began to question their own circumstances. The ripple effects of her transformation extended through drawing rooms and social gatherings across 2 continents. As conversations that had once focused exclusively on fashion and gossip began to include discussions of women's rights and social reform, the psychological toll of living between 2 worlds, the conventional one she was expected to inhabit and the authentic one she was creating, cannot be understated. Consuelo found herself constantly translating between different versions of herself, presenting the appropriate facade in traditional social settings while pursuing her real interests in more progressive circles. This double consciousness required enormous emotional energy and created a kind of internal exhaustion that she described in her private writings as both liberating and overwhelming. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman grappling with questions that had no clear precedent in her social circle. How does one maintain relationships with family members who view your choices as incomprehensible betrayals? How do you explain to children why their mother has chosen a path so different from other women they know? How do you balance the desire for personal authenticity with the responsibility to use your privilege for broader social good? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but daily practical challenges that required constant navigation and adjustment. The financial complexities of her new life also demanded skills that her privileged upbringing had never taught her. As a duchess, others had managed her money, made investment decisions, and handled business arrangements on her behalf. But independence meant learning to understand financial markets, evaluate investment opportunities, and make strategic decisions about how to allocate her resources between personal needs and philanthropic commitments. This education in practical money management was both empowering and sometimes overwhelming for someone who had never been expected to think about such matters. Her approach to these financial challenges reflected her broader philosophy about the relationship between privilege and responsibility. She viewed her wealth not as an entitlement to be preserved at all costs, but as a resource that should be deployed strategically to advance causes she believed in. This perspective led her to make investment decisions based partly on their potential social impact rather than purely on their financial returns, an approach that was considered radical in business circles of her era. The homes she created during her years of independence became laboratories for experimenting with different ways of living that reflected her evolving values. Instead of the formal, hierarchical arrangements that characterized aristocratic households, she developed more egalitarian domestic environments where servants were treated with greater respect and consideration. Her staff often stayed with her for years, attracted not just by fair wages, but by working conditions that recognized their dignity and contributions. These household innovations extended to her entertaining style as well. The elaborate dinner parties and formal receptions that had characterized her life as a duchess gave way to more intimate gatherings focused on meaningful conversation and shared interests. Her guest lists began to include people from diverse backgrounds who were united by their commitment to social reform rather than their social pedigree. These gatherings became famous in their own right, but for very different reasons than the society events of her earlier life. The intellectual salons she hosted became important venues for cross-pollinating ideas between different reform movements and social causes. Labour organisers met suffrage advocates, educational reformers encountered housing activists, and international perspectives were shared among people working on similar issues in different countries. These connections often led to collaborative efforts that were more effective than any single organisation could have achieved alone. Her relationship with the press evolved significantly during this period as well. As a duchess, she had been a subject of fascination for society reporters who focused on her clothing, her entertaining, and her social activities. But as an independent advocate, she learned to use media attention strategically to advance the causes she supported. She gave interviews about social issues, wrote articles for publications, and used her celebrity status to draw attention to problems that might otherwise have been ignored. The transition from being a passive subject of media coverage to an active participant in public discourse required her to develop new skills and overcome deep-seated reservations about self-promotion. Her upbringing had taught her that ladies should avoid public attention and controversy, but her advocacy work required her to court both. Learning to navigate this contradiction took considerable emotional and intellectual adjustment. The international scope of her activities expanded as her confidence and expertise grew. She began to travel not as a tourist or social visitor, but as someone studying different approaches to social problems and policy solutions. Her trips to various European countries allowed her to observe different models of social welfare, labour regulation, and women's rights that she could then advocate for implementing in the United States. This comparative perspective made her advocacy more sophisticated and credible. Her evolving relationship with her children during this period reflected the broader challenges facing parents who were pioneering new roles and relationships. She wanted to provide them with security and stability, while also modelling independence and authenticity. The balance between protecting them from the social consequences of her choices and preparing them to make their own unconventional decisions required constant attention and adjustment. The education she arranged for her children reflected her transformed values and priorities. Instead of focusing exclusively on social accomplishments and appropriate behaviour, she ensured they received serious academic training and exposure to diverse perspectives and experiences. She wanted them to understand both their privileges and their responsibilities, and to develop the skills and confidence they would need to make their own choices about how to use their advantages. Her sons' reactions to their mother's transformation varied over time and reflected the complex dynamics of families navigating social change. Initially, they sometimes felt embarrassed or confused by her unconventional choices, particularly when these choices attracted negative attention or social criticism. But as they matured, they began to appreciate the courage and integrity their mother had demonstrated, and several of them eventually became advocates for social reform themselves. The legal precedents established through her divorce and subsequent arrangements had implications that extended far beyond her individual situation. The negotiations over property rights, custody arrangements, and financial settlements created models that other women could reference when pursuing their own divorces. The fact that she had managed to maintain both her independence and her relationships with her children challenged assumptions about the inevitable consequences of leaving an unhappy marriage. Her second marriage represented a conscious rejection of the transactional approach that had characterized her first union. Instead of a relationship arranged for social and financial advantage, she chose a partnership based on genuine compatibility, shared interests, and mutual respect. The success of this marriage demonstrated that it was possible for someone who had endured an arranged marriage to find authentic love and companionship later in life. The contrast between her two marriages became a powerful symbol of the broader changes happening in how relationships were understood and structured. Her first marriage represented the old system, where family interests took precedence over individual happiness, while her second embodied the emerging ideal of companionate marriage based on personal choice and emotional connection. This evolution reflected broader cultural shifts that would continue to influence relationship patterns for generations. The professional recognition she received for her advocacy work provided validation that had been completely absent from her earlier accomplishments. The awards, honorary degrees, and public acknowledgements she earned were based on her own efforts and achievements rather than her family connections or marriage arrangements. This recognition affirmed her sense of individual worth and capability in ways that inherited status had never provided. Her influence on other women of her generation was both direct and indirect. Some sought her advice and support as they contemplated their own challenges and decisions. Others simply observed her example from a distance and drew courage from seeing someone successfully navigate the transition from conventional to authentic living. Her story became part of a broader narrative of women's liberation that inspired others to question their own circumstances and consider alternative possibilities. The organizations she helped establish and fund during this period outlasted her own involvement and continued to advance the causes she cared about for decades after her death. Her investment in institutional change, rather than just individual charity, created lasting impact that extended far beyond what she could have accomplished through personal generosity alone. These organizations became vehicles through which her influence continued to shape social policy and cultural attitudes long after she was gone. Her memoir, written in her later years, provided an unprecedented insider's account of the forces that shaped the lives of Gilded Age women. Her willingness to describe honestly the pressures, constraints, and manipulations she had experienced offered future generations insights into a world that had previously been hidden behind veils of discretion and social convention. This documentation became an invaluable historical resource for understanding the human costs of seemingly glamorous lifestyles. The broader impact of her story extended beyond gender issues to touch on fundamental questions about individual autonomy, social responsibility, and the relationship between privilege and purpose. Her journey from passive object to active agent challenged assumptions not just about women's capabilities, but about how wealth and status should be used and what constitutes a meaningful life. These questions remain relevant today as each generation grapples with similar tensions between individual desires and social expectations. The courage she displayed in choosing authenticity over approval, despite enormous personal and social costs, demonstrated that change was possible even under the most restrictive circumstances. Her willingness to risk everything she had been taught to value for the sake of living according to her own convictions provided a powerful example of moral courage that transcended the specific circumstances of her historical moment. Understanding Consuelo's individual transformation provides a window into the broader experiences of Gilded Age women who found themselves navigating the tension between unprecedented material advantages and systematic personal constraints. These women lived at a unique historical moment when vast fortunes created possibilities for luxury and influence that previous generations could never have imagined, while social conventions remained rigidly traditional in ways that severely limited individual autonomy and self-determination. The daily routines of wealthy women during this era were choreographed with the precision of elaborate theatrical productions. Every social interaction was governed by complex rules that determined appropriate behavior, conversation topics, and even physical gestures. The morning ritual of receiving callers required specific protocols for how long visits should last, what refreshments should be served, and which topics were suitable for discussion. Afternoon drives in Central Park followed prescribed routes at designated times, with specific rules about acknowledging other carriages and their occupants. The seasonal migrations between different residences created additional layers of complexity and constraint. Summer homes in Newport required entirely different wardrobes, social activities, and behavioral expectations than winter residences in New York City. The European tours that many families undertook annually involved months of preparation, elaborate travel arrangements, and careful attention to diplomatic protocols when interacting with foreign nobility. Every aspect of these movements was designed to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate family wealth and status. The marriages arranged for young women of this class were negotiated with the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that characterized major business mergers. Families employed investigators to research potential suitors' financial situations, moral characters, and family histories. Lawyers drew up complex prenuptial agreements that specified everything from allowance amounts to inheritance arrangements to behavioral expectations. The actual preferences and feelings of the young women involved were considered secondary to these practical considerations. The education provided to daughters of wealthy families was carefully calibrated to make them attractive marriage prospects, without developing capabilities that might threaten potential husbands or challenge social conventions. Languages, music, and art were emphasized because they demonstrated cultural refinement and provided appropriate topics for social conversation. But serious academic subjects, business training, or professional preparation were generally discouraged as unsuitable for women who were expected to become ornamental wives and mothers. The elaborate wardrobes required for women of this social level involved constant attention and enormous expense. Different activities demanded specific types of clothing, with separate outfits required for morning calls, afternoon entertainments, dinner parties, and evening social events. The fabrics, jewels, and accessories that adorned these garments often cost more than most families earned in entire years. Yet women were expected to appear effortlessly elegant while navigating the complex requirements of appropriate dress for every occasion. The servant hierarchies that managed these elaborate households created their own systems of power and control. Ladies' maids held privileged positions that allowed them intimate access to their employers' private lives, but this access came with strict requirements for discretion and loyalty. Housekeepers managed staffs of dozens while maintaining the illusion that elaborate entertainments and perfectly maintained homes required no effort or planning. The smooth operation of these domestic machines required constant supervision and coordination that was largely invisible to the outside world. The charitable activities that provided acceptable outlets for women's energies were themselves governed by complex social rules and expectations. Certain causes were considered more appropriate than others for ladies of particular social standings. The methods used to raise funds and provide assistance had to conform to standards of gentility that sometimes made them less effective than more direct approaches might have been. Even philanthropy became a form of social performance that was judged as much on style and propriety as on actual impact. The international marriages that characterized this era created unique challenges for American women who found themselves navigating foreign social systems while maintaining connections to their home country. European aristocratic traditions were often even more restrictive than American social conventions, with centuries-old protocols governing every aspect of daily life. The castles and country estates that came with noble titles were magnificent but also isolated, cutting these women off from the relatively informal social networks they had known in America. The financial arrangements that made these international marriages possible were themselves sources of ongoing tension and complexity. American fortunes were used to restore European estates and maintain aristocratic lifestyles, but the women who brought this wealth often found themselves with limited control over how it was spent. Their money rescued crumbling castles and supported elaborate court ceremonies, but they frequently had to request permission for personal expenses or charitable contributions. The children born into these transatlantic unions faced their own unique challenges in navigating multiple cultural identities and social expectations. They were raised with American wealth but European titles, educated in British traditions but expected to maintain connections to American relatives and business interests. Their marriages and career choices had to balance the requirements of their inherited positions with their personal preferences and contemporary social changes. The elaborate social seasons that structured the lives of these families created artificial environments where genuine human connections were difficult to develop and maintain. The constant round of formal entertainments, ceremonial obligations, and social visits left little time or space for authentic relationships or personal reflection. Women moved through these activities like performers in an endless series of theatrical productions, always aware that their behavior was being observed and judged by others. The pressure to maintain perfect appearances at all times created psychological strains that were rarely acknowledged or addressed. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges were common among women of this class, but they were typically attributed to personal weakness or moral failing, rather than recognized as responses to impossible social pressures. The elaborate medical treatments and rest cures that were popular during this era often served more to remove troubled women from social view than to address the underlying causes of their distress. The intellectual capabilities of these women were systematically underutilized and undervalued by the social systems that governed their lives. Many possessed sharp minds, creative talents, and leadership abilities that could have contributed significantly to business, politics, arts, or social reform. But the narrow roles available to them provided few opportunities to develop or demonstrate these capabilities. The waste of human potential represented by these restrictions was enormous and largely unrecognized by contemporary society. The legal systems of the era provided women with few protections or remedies when marriages proved unsatisfactory or abusive. Divorce was difficult to obtain, socially stigmatizing, and financially devastating for women who lacked independent resources. Property rights were limited, and child custody typically favored fathers regardless of their fitness or the circumstances of the separation. These legal constraints made it extremely difficult for women to leave unhappy situations, even when they had the personal courage to do so. The international nature of many of these marriages created additional legal complications that made divorce and separation even more complex and expensive. Different countries had different laws governing marriage, property, and inheritance, and navigating these competing legal systems required extensive legal expertise and significant financial resources. The jurisdictional questions alone could take years to resolve, during which time women remained trapped in unsatisfactory situations. The social ostracism that followed divorce or separation could be devastating for women who had been raised to value social acceptance and approval above personal happiness. Former friends often refused to acknowledge divorced women in public. Invitations to social events ceased, and even family members sometimes withdrew their support. The isolation that resulted from these social sanctions could be more painful than the original unhappiness that had motivated the decision to leave a marriage. The economic vulnerabilities that women faced when they chose to challenge social expectations were often underestimated by those who viewed them as pampered and privileged. While some had access to family fortunes that could support independent lives, others found themselves financially dependent on husbands or male relatives who could withdraw support as punishment for unconventional behavior. The threat of economic destitution was a powerful tool for maintaining social control over women who might otherwise have chosen different paths. The generational tensions that emerged as younger women began to question traditional expectations created conflicts within families that could last for decades. Mothers who had sacrificed their own desires to secure their daughters' social positions felt betrayed when those daughters rejected the lives that had been so carefully arranged for them. The psychological and emotional costs of these family conflicts added another layer of difficulty to the already challenging process of social change. The emergence of new educational opportunities for women during the later part of this era created both possibilities and tensions that affected the entire social system. As colleges and universities began to admit women, and as new institutions designed specifically for women's education were established, young women gained access to intellectual experiences that prepared them for roles beyond traditional domestic duties. But these educational opportunities also created expectations and ambitions that were difficult to fulfill within existing social structures. The professional opportunities that began to open for educated women created additional challenges for families trying to maintain traditional arrangements while adapting to changing social realities. Some families embraced these new possibilities and encouraged their daughters to pursue careers in teaching, social work, or other acceptable professions. Others viewed these opportunities as threats to family stability and worked to discourage their daughters from pursuing independent careers. The suffrage movement that gained momentum during this period provided a focus for women's frustrations with their limited political and legal rights. The campaign for voting rights connected to broader questions about women's capabilities, social roles, and relationship to public life. The involvement of wealthy women in suffrage activities brought resources and social connections to the movement, while also exposing them to criticism and opposition from their own social circles. The organizational skills that women developed through their charitable and suffrage work proved transferable to other areas of social and political activism. The same capabilities that made them effective at managing hospital fundraising campaigns or coordinating relief efforts could be applied to labor organizing, consumer advocacy, or political reform movements. As women gained confidence in their abilities and effectiveness, they began to expand the scope of their activities and challenge broader social and economic arrangements. The cultural and artistic contributions of women from this era were often overshadowed by their social and political activities, but they were nonetheless significant in shaping American cultural development. Many became patrons of the arts, supporting musicians, painters, writers, and other creative individuals whose work might not have found audiences or financial backing otherwise. Some pursued their own artistic endeavors, though often under constraints that limited their ability to achieve recognition or commercial success. The international connections that many of these women maintained throughout their lives facilitated cultural exchange and the spread of ideas across national boundaries. Their travels, correspondence, and social networks created channels through which artistic movements, political innovations, and social reform ideas could move between different countries and cultures. This cosmopolitan perspective enriched American cultural and intellectual life, while also exposing Americans to alternative approaches to social and political organization. The legacy of these Gilded Age women extended far beyond their immediate historical moment and continued to influence American society throughout the 20th century and into contemporary times. The questions they raised about individual autonomy, social responsibility, and the relationship between privilege and purpose remain relevant today as each generation grapples with similar tensions between personal desires and social expectations. The courage they displayed in challenging conventional expectations, despite significant personal and social costs, created precedents and examples that inspired future generations of women to pursue their own paths toward authenticity and fulfillment. Their willingness to risk security, status, and approval for the sake of living according to their own convictions demonstrated that social change was possible even under the most restrictive circumstances. The institutions they established, the causes they supported, and the cultural changes they helped initiate created lasting impacts that extended far beyond their individual lifetimes. Their investment in education, social reform, and women's rights created foundations upon which subsequent generations could build, expanding opportunities and possibilities in ways that continue to benefit society today. Understanding their experiences provides insights not just into a fascinating historical period, but into the ongoing human challenges of balancing individual authenticity with social expectations, personal fulfillment with family responsibilities, and the pursuit of happiness with the maintenance of social stability. These tensions were not unique to the Gilded Age, but continue to shape human relationships and social arrangements in various forms throughout history and into our contemporary world. The story of women like Consuelo Vanderbilt reminds us that social progress often begins with individual acts of courage, and that the personal choices made by ordinary people, even those with extraordinary privileges, can have far-reaching consequences for broader social development. Their willingness to question assumptions, to risk disapproval, and to pursue authentic lives helped create possibilities that we continue to benefit from today, while also demonstrating the ongoing importance of individual courage in the face of social pressure to conform to limiting expectations. The transformation that Consuelo underwent during her years of independence reveals something profound about the human capacity for reinvention when freed from suffocating constraints. By the time she reached her 40s, she had become unrecognizable from the tearful 18-year-old bride who had walked down that aisle in 1895. The woman who emerged from the wreckage of her arranged marriage possessed a steel core that no one, including herself, had suspected existed beneath years of dutiful compliance. Her second marriage, entered into with clear eyes and an open heart, demonstrated everything her first union had lacked. Jacques Balsan was a French aviator and automobile manufacturer who admired her intelligence, supported her independence, and shared her passion for social reform. Their relationship was built on genuine affection rather than financial necessity, mutual respect rather than social obligation. The contrast was so stark that friends who had known her during both marriages often remarked that she seemed like an entirely different person. The home they created together in France became a sanctuary where intellectuals, artists, and reformers gathered to discuss the pressing issues of their time. Unlike the stiff formality of Blenheim Palace or the calculated grandeur of the Vanderbilt mansion, this was a place where authentic conversation flourished and meaningful relationships developed. The guest rooms housed suffragettes planning their next campaign, writers working on novels that would challenge social conventions, and politicians developing legislation to improve working conditions for the poor. What made Consuelo's later years particularly remarkable was how she channeled her earlier suffering into purposeful action. The pain of her forced marriage became empathy for other women trapped in similar circumstances. The isolation she had experienced as a duchess translated into advocacy for legal reforms that would give women more control over their own lives. Her personal liberation became a template that other women could follow, proof that even the most restrictive circumstances could be overcome through courage and determination. Her involvement in the women's suffrage movement during the final push for voting rights brought all of her skills and experiences into perfect alignment. She understood both the drawing room politics that could influence wealthy donors and the grassroots organizing needed to build broad public support. Her ability to move seamlessly between different social worlds made her uniquely effective at building the coalitions necessary for political change. The speeches she gave during suffrage rallies revealed an eloquence and passion that had been completely suppressed during her years as a duchess. Standing before crowds of working women, wealthy socialites, and middle-class reformers, she spoke about the fundamental injustice of a system that denied half the population any voice in their own governance. Her personal story gave weight to her words in ways that pure political arguments could never achieve. The legal victory of women's suffrage in 1920 represented more than just political progress for Consuelo. It validated her belief that seemingly impossible changes could be achieved through persistent effort and strategic organizing. The same system that had once seemed immovably oppressive had been forced to acknowledge women's fundamental rights as citizens. If something as entrenched as male-only voting could be overturned, then other barriers to women's equality might also prove more fragile than they appeared. Her writing during this period reflected both her intellectual development and her desire to document the experiences of her generation for future women who might face similar challenges. Her memoirs, published when she was in her 70s, provided an unprecedented insider's account of the forces that had shaped the lives of Gilded Age heiresses. She wrote with unflinching honesty about the psychological manipulation she had endured, the social pressures that had nearly destroyed her spirit, and the long journey towards self-discovery and authentic living. The The reaction to her book revealed how much society had changed during her lifetime. Younger readers were shocked by her descriptions of arranged marriages and parental control that seemed medieval in their severity. But older women recognized their own experiences in her story and found validation for struggles they had never been able to articulate. The book became a bridge between generations, helping younger women understand the constraints their mothers and grandmothers had faced, while providing older women with a vocabulary for discussing their own suppressed dreams and disappointed hopes. Her later years were marked by a serenity that had been completely absent from her youth. The constant anxiety about meeting others' expectations had been replaced by confidence in her own judgment and values. She moved through the world with the easy grace of someone who had finally learned to trust herself. The desperate need for approval that had once driven her every action had been transformed into a genuine desire to help others find their own paths to fulfillment and authenticity. Her relationships with her children, now adults with families of their own, reflected this transformation as well. Instead of the formal distance that had characterized aristocratic parenting during her youth, she developed warm, genuine connections with her sons based on mutual respect and shared interests. They saw in her not just a mother who had fulfilled her social obligations, but a woman who had demonstrated remarkable courage in choosing her own path, despite enormous social and personal costs. The grandchildren who surrounded her during her final years knew her only as the vibrant, independent woman she had become. To them, she was simply a grandmother who told fascinating stories about a bygone era, who supported causes she believed in, and who encouraged them to think for themselves and pursue their own dreams. They could hardly imagine the constrained, unhappy young woman she had once been. So complete was her transformation. Her death in 1964 marked the end of an era in more ways than one. She was among the last survivors of the original Gilded Age generation, one of the few people still living who could remember firsthand the elaborate social machinery that had governed the lives of America's wealthiest families at the turn of the century. But more than that, her death represented the passing of a pioneer who had helped create new possibilities for women's lives that subsequent generations would take for granted. The obituaries that appeared in newspapers around the world struggled to capture the full significance of her life and transformation. The society pages remembered her as one of the most glamorous brides of the 1890s and the Duchess of Marlborough, who had presided over magnificent entertainments at Blenheim Palace. The political sections noted her contributions to the suffrage movement and various social reform causes, but none fully conveyed the quiet heroism of a woman who had refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her life. The broader story of Gilded Age women that Consuelo's life illuminated reveals patterns and experiences that extended far beyond individual circumstances. These women lived at a unique historical moment when unprecedented material prosperity existed alongside rigid social constraints that limited their ability to direct their own lives. The very wealth that provided them with luxury and privilege also became the instrument of their control, as families used financial leverage to enforce compliance with social expectations. The marriages arranged for women of this class followed predictable patterns that prioritized financial and social considerations over personal compatibility or individual happiness. Young women were evaluated like valuable commodities, with their beauty, accomplishments, and family connections assessed as assets that could be traded for advantageous alliances. The negotiations that preceded these marriages resembled business mergers more than romantic courtships, with lawyers and financial advisors playing larger roles than the supposed lovers themselves. The international nature of many of these unions created additional layers of complexity and constraint. American heiresses who married European nobility found themselves navigating foreign social systems while maintaining connections to their families and homeland. The cultural adjustments required were enormous, as American informality clashed with centuries-old European protocols and traditions. Many of these women spent years learning to move comfortably within social systems that were even more restrictive than those they had known at home. The daily routines of wealthy women during this era were choreographed with precision that left little room for spontaneity or personal expression. Every social interaction was governed by complex rules that determined appropriate behavior, conversation topics, and even physical gestures. The morning ritual of receiving callers required specific protocols about visit duration and refreshment service. Afternoon entertainments demanded particular types of dress and conversation. Evening social events involved intricate hierarchies that determined seating arrangements and social precedents. The seasonal migrations between different residences created additional opportunities for social display while also reinforcing the artificial nature of these women's lives. Summer homes in Newport required entirely different wardrobes and social activities than winter residences in New York or European estates. These movements were carefully orchestrated to maximize social impact while also demonstrating family wealth and status through the sheer logistics involved in maintaining multiple elaborate households. The education provided to daughters of wealthy families was designed to make them attractive marriage prospects rather than independent individuals. Languages, music, and art were emphasized because they demonstrated cultural refinement and provided appropriate topics for social conversation. But serious academic subjects, professional training, or business education were generally discouraged as unsuitable for women who were expected to become ornamental wives and mothers rather than autonomous adults. The elaborate wardrobes required for women of this social level involved constant attention and enormous expense. Different activities demanded specific types of clothing, with separate outfits required for various times of day and social occasions. The fabrics, jewelry, and accessories that adorn these garments often cost more than most families earned in entire years. Yet women were expected to appear effortlessly elegant while navigating complex requirements for appropriate dress that changed with fashion trends and social expectations. The charitable activities that provided acceptable outlets for women's energies were themselves constrained by social rules and expectations. Certain causes were considered more appropriate than others for ladies of particular social standings. The methods used to raise funds and provide assistance had to conform to standards of gentility that sometimes made them less effective than more direct approaches might have been. Even philanthropy became a form of social performance, judged as much on style and propriety as on actual impact. The servant hierarchies that managed elaborate households created complex systems of power and dependency. Ladies' maids held privileged positions that provided intimate access to their employers' private lives. But this access came with strict requirements for discretion and loyalty. Housekeepers managed staffs of dozens, while maintaining the illusion that elaborate entertainments and perfectly maintained homes required no effort or planning. The smooth operation of these domestic enterprises required constant supervision that was largely invisible to the outside world. The psychological pressures of maintaining perfect appearances at all times created mental health challenges that were rarely acknowledged or properly addressed. Depression, anxiety, and other emotional difficulties were common among women of this class, but they were typically attributed to personal weakness or moral failing rather than recognized as responses to impossible social expectations. The elaborate medical treatments and rest cures popular during this era often served more to remove troubled women from social view than to address underlying causes of their distress. The intellectual capabilities of these women were systematically underutilized by social systems that valued ornamental accomplishments over substantive achievements. Many possessed sharp minds, creative talents, and leadership abilities that could have contributed significantly to business, politics, arts, or social reform. But the narrow roles available to them provided few opportunities to develop or demonstrate these capabilities fully. The waste of human potential represented by these restrictions was enormous and largely unrecognized by contemporary society. The legal systems of the era provided women with few protections when marriages proved unsatisfactory or abusive. Divorce was difficult to obtain, socially stigmatizing, and financially devastating for women who lacked independent resources. Property rights were limited, and child custody typically favored fathers, regardless of circumstances. These legal constraints made it extremely difficult for women to leave unhappy situations, even when they possessed the personal courage to do so. The economic vulnerabilities that women faced when challenging social expectations were often underestimated by those who viewed them as pampered and privileged. While some had access to family fortunes that could support independent lives, others found themselves financially dependent on husbands or male relatives who could withdraw support as punishment for unconventional behavior. The threat of economic destitution was a powerful tool for maintaining social control over women who might otherwise have chosen different paths. The generational tensions that emerged as younger women began questioning traditional expectations created conflicts within families that could persist for decades. Mothers who had sacrificed their own desires to secure their daughters' social positions felt betrayed when those daughters rejected lives that had been so carefully arranged. The psychological and emotional costs of these family conflicts added another layer of difficulty to the already challenging process of social change. The emergence of new educational opportunities for women during the later part of this era created both possibilities and tensions that affected entire social systems. As colleges and universities began admitting women, and as new institutions designed specifically for women's education were established, young women gained access to intellectual experiences that prepared them for roles beyond traditional domestic duties. But these educational opportunities also created expectations and ambitions that were difficult to fulfill within existing social structures. The professional opportunities that began opening for educated women created additional challenges for families trying to maintain traditional arrangements while adapting to changing social realities. Some families embraced new possibilities and encouraged daughters to pursue careers in teaching, social work, or other acceptable professions. Others viewed these opportunities as threats to family stability and worked to discourage daughters from pursuing independent careers that might challenge conventional gender roles. The suffrage movement that gained momentum during this period provided focus for women's frustrations with their limited political and legal rights. The campaign for voting rights connected to broader questions about women's capabilities, social roles, and relationship to public life. The involvement of wealthy women in suffrage activities brought resources and social connections to the movement, while also exposing them to criticism and opposition from their own social circles. The organizational skills that women developed through charitable and suffrage work proved transferable to other areas of social and political activism. The same capabilities that made them effective at managing hospital fundraising campaigns or coordinating relief efforts could be applied to labor organizing, consumer advocacy, or political reform movements. As women gained confidence in their abilities and effectiveness, they began expanding the scope of their activities and challenging broader social and economic arrangements. The cultural and artistic contributions of women from this era were often overshadowed by their social and political activities, but they were nonetheless significant in shaping American cultural development. Many became patrons of arts, supporting musicians, painters, writers, and other creative individuals whose work might not have found audiences or financial backing otherwise. Some pursued their own artistic endeavors, though often under constraints that limited their ability to achieve recognition or commercial success. The international connections that many of these women maintained throughout their lives facilitated cultural exchange and the spread of ideas across national boundaries. Their travels, correspondence, and social networks created channels through which artistic movements, political innovations, and social reform ideas could move between different countries and cultures. This cosmopolitan perspective enriched American cultural and intellectual life, while also exposing Americans to alternative approaches to social and political organization. The legacy of these Gilded Age women extended far beyond their immediate historical moment and continued influencing American society throughout the 20th century and into contemporary times. The questions they raised about individual autonomy, social responsibility, and the relationship between privilege and purpose remain relevant today as each generation grapples with similar tensions between personal desires and social expectations. The courage they displayed in challenging conventional expectations, despite significant personal and social costs, created precedents and examples that inspired future generations of women to pursue their own paths toward authenticity and fulfillment. Their willingness to risk security, status, and approval for the sake of living according to their own convictions demonstrated that social change was possible even under the most restrictive circumstances. The institutions they established, causes they supported, and cultural changes they helped initiate created lasting impacts that extended far beyond their individual lifetimes. Their investment in education, social reform, and women's rights created foundations upon which subsequent generations could build, expanding opportunities and possibilities in ways that continue benefiting society today. Understanding their experiences provides insights not just into a fascinating historical period, but into ongoing human challenges of balancing individual authenticity with social expectations, personal fulfillment with family responsibilities, and the pursuit of happiness with the maintenance of social stability. These tensions were not unique to the Gilded Age, but continue shaping human relationships and social arrangements in various forms throughout history and into our contemporary world. The story of women like Consuelo Vanderbilt reminds us that social progress often begins with individual acts of courage, and that personal choices made by ordinary people, even those with extraordinary privileges, can have far-reaching consequences for broader social development. Their willingness to question assumptions, to risk disapproval, and to pursue authentic lives helped create possibilities that we continue benefiting from today, while also demonstrating the ongoing importance of individual courage in the face of social pressure to conform to limiting expectations. The transformation of these women from constrained ornaments into independent advocates represents one of the most significant social changes of the modern era. Their journey from passive objects of family ambition to active agents of social reform illustrates the human capacity for growth and reinvention, even under the most challenging circumstances. Their stories continue to inspire and instruct, reminding us that the cages that seem strongest are often more fragile than they appear, and that the courage to seek authenticity over approval can transform not just individual lives, but entire societies. As we reach the end of our journey through Consuelo's extraordinary life, it's important to understand that her story was not unique in its basic elements, though it was certainly exceptional in its outcome. Across the grand mansions of Fifth Avenue and the sprawling estates of Newport, countless other young women were living variations of the same tale. They too were raised like precious orchids in carefully controlled environments, educated just enough to be interesting, but not enough to be threatening, and ultimately presented to society like beautiful objects in a marketplace where their value was determined by their family's wealth and their own physical attractiveness. The Gilded Age created a generation of women who possessed everything except the one thing that mattered most: the freedom to choose their own paths. They lived in palaces but could not leave without permission. They owned jewels worth fortunes but could not spend their own money without approval. They were surrounded by servants, but remained prisoners of expectations that governed every moment of their existence. The golden chains that bound them were so beautifully crafted that many never realized they were chains at all. What made Consuelo's story remarkable was not that she suffered under this system, but that she found the courage to break free from it. Her transformation from tearful bride to independent advocate demonstrated that even the most restrictive circumstances could be overcome through determination and authentic self-discovery. She proved that it was possible to reject a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within, and to create something genuine and meaningful in its place. The ripple effects of her choices extended far beyond her own circumstances. Every woman who watched her navigate the treacherous waters of divorce and social ostracism, every daughter who saw her mother's friend choose personal happiness over social approval, every young bride who heard whispered stories about the Duchess who had dared to leave her palace, gained a small seed of possibility that might one day grow into their own transformation. Consuelo's courage gave others permission to question their own circumstances and imagine different futures for themselves. The world these women inhabited was one where appearance mattered more than substance, where duty was valued above happiness, and where individual desires were considered selfish indulgences that threatened family honor and social stability. Yet within these constraints, many found ways to create meaning and purpose. They channeled their energies into charitable work that allowed them to exercise real authority and see tangible results from their efforts. They became patrons of arts and education, using their resources to support causes that reflected their values, even when they could not openly challenge the system that constrained them. The networks of support and friendship that developed among these women became lifelines that sustained them through the darkest moments of their restricted lives. In drawing rooms and garden parties, behind fans and over teacups, they shared their dreams and frustrations with others who understood their struggles. These relationships provided emotional sustenance and practical guidance that helped many survive circumstances that might otherwise have crushed their spirits entirely. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the rigid structures that had governed these women's lives began to show signs of strain and flexibility. The suffrage movement gave them a concrete goal around which to organize their frustrations and energies. 2 world wars disrupted traditional social arrangements and created new opportunities for women to demonstrate their capabilities in public spheres. Economic changes made it possible for some women to achieve financial independence through their own efforts, rather than depending entirely on male relatives or husbands. But change came slowly and unevenly, and many women spent their entire lives waiting for freedoms that would only become available to their daughters and granddaughters. They watched from the sidelines as younger generations took for granted opportunities that had been unimaginable during their own youth. Some felt bitter about the sacrifices they had made for a system that was ultimately abandoned. Others found satisfaction in knowing that their endurance and quiet resistance had helped create possibilities for future generations. The legacy of the Gilded Age women extends far beyond their historical moment and continues to influence our understanding of the relationship between privilege and freedom, individual desires and social expectations. Their experiences remind us that wealth and status do not automatically translate into personal autonomy, and that the most beautiful cages are often the most difficult to recognize and escape. Their stories teach us that authentic living requires courage, that meaningful change often comes at significant personal cost, and that the choices made by individuals can have consequences that extend far beyond their own lives. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of grand ballrooms and glittering jewels, of magnificent estates and elaborate ceremonies. But remember too the women who moved through these spaces with grace and dignity, while carrying dreams and disappointments that few ever suspected. Remember Consuelo Vanderbilt, who transformed her pain into purpose and her constraints into compassion, proving that even the most gilded cage cannot contain a spirit determined to be free. Her story reminds us that every generation faces the choice between conformity and authenticity, between security and growth, between the life others expect us to live and the life we know in our hearts we are meant to live. The courage to choose authenticity over approval, meaning over comfort, and truth over convention remains as relevant today as it was in the glittering but constraining world of America's Gilded Age. Sweet dreams, and may you find the courage to write your own story of transformation and authentic living, whatever golden cages might currently surround you.